EarthBound is an incredible game, rich in humor, atmosphere, and heart. However, it does seem many of the game's die-hard fans today were already exposed to many of its story elements before being able to play the game for themselves. Many younger fans being exposed to the series through Let's Plays of the game after discovering the characters through the Super Smash Bros. Series. This blind experience wasn't just robbed from them, however, as the US release of the game all the way back in 1995 included a player's guide with every copy of the game, which no doubt many players used to complete it. I speak as a member of this very group, as I made use of the guide because it was there. However, what many haven't experienced is how the game naturally leads its players through its story, and does so much more clearly than many would likely believe. Which is why with this series, I intend on documenting this very process and explaining how the game's design choices accomplish this very goal. Along the way, I will also be making note of how specific choices made help to convey the game's story on a visual as well as a deeper thematic level. I will also be leaving room open for criticism, as like any other work of art, it's not perfect, and I love this game so much that I'm willing to see its flaws and love them in spite of and for them. I'll be attempting to analyze the game through two different lenses. One of is that of the player familiar with other role-playing games contemporary to EarthBound as an American player, as players in Japan would already be somewhat familiar with many of the series' trademarks due to them receiving the release of Mother 5 years prior. Due to this decision, the series will be focusing on the game's American localization, so sadly some of the original substance will be lost, but truthfully I am not nearly fluent enough in Japanese culture to be able to give a thorough analysis of Mother 2. The other lens I will be observing the game through is one of a player new to the genre of turn-based RPGs and how the game teaches its elements to them. My goal is to help fans and freshmen to the series better understand why the game is so highly revered and influential, as well as to demonstrate the power of artistic decisions when attempting to craft an experience, and creating a sense of flow, which is an integral part to telling a story. Finally, I hope to also better understand myself why I love this game so much, and have such a profound attachment to it. With this playthrough, I'll only be playing as far into the game with each installment to the series as I make it, so bear with me that there will be adjustments made over time. Lastly, please understand that my understanding and recognition of the large abundance of references to other media made throughout the game is limited to my knowledge and understanding of said media, so this analysis will be restricted to my knowledge of said things. This is my EarthBound analysis. As the player starts up the game, following the logos of the developers and producers, they are welcomed to the world of EarthBound with red TV static, accompanied by distant alien sounds, which become apparent as being alien sounds as the screen fades into an image paying homage to the 1953 film The War of the Worlds, which in turn is based on the 1888 novel of the same name. I will acknowledge the significance of the red static later in this series, so for now we'll just be mentioning it briefly. This simple transition made between these two screens, though, conveys to the player that they are entering a sinister yet fantasized heightened world, being pulled into the television in a sense. The image is the player's first visual detailing into the world they're about to enter, and the washed out colors evoking imagery of an old Polaroid. This cluing the player in that the world of EarthBound is one of nostalgia, not only culturally as demonstrated by the reference to War of the Worlds, but one harkening back to childhood. Though this is elaborated on and made much more clear later, this palette choice attempts to make the player think of their own memories, ones that a kid in the mid-1990s when the game came out would only be documented through Polaroids most likely. This is also demonstrated through the image's use of classic cars and an old-school looking city as its setting. Additionally, the use of bended letterboxing visually conveys that this world, while nostalgic, is also one that is distorted, and clues the player in that it's also a weird one that will challenge and even question reality. The use of the wording, "The War Against Gygus," is also reminiscent of old-fashioned newspaper headlines, reiterating the game's cultural nostalgia, and also introduces the game's visual motif of relating Gygus and red. Following the sinister alien sounds, the sky in the image flashes white several times, indicating that the world inside the cartridge is coming to life, the color white often throughout the game enveloping the screen to convey thematic elements of awakening, or something grand or significant happening. This is also being conveyed through the sound effect playing, which evokes the image of some sort of alien spacecraft opening, a la Encounters of the Third Kind, another property that will get heavy homage paid to it in the near future. The screen then fades to black, indicating it's time for the game to start, the lights coming down in a sense, like when a play or a film is starting. The title then comes into frame in pure white, again indicating its important information before fading into its iconic orange-purple gradient. It should be noted that the title coming in from both sides of the screen was a much more radical choice for a title screen contemporarily than one might think, as the common choice for grand RPGs of the time was to have what could be considered a more tasteful one, where the title would fade in, oftentimes with some form of classical or traditionally grand orchestral music. EarthBound, however, stylizes its soundtrack with a greater sense of funk and pop, introducing to the player that despite the 1950s styled screen before it, the game is about the now being 1995. The title's gradient resembles the sunset, a colloquially understood to be beautiful moment at the end of a day, something that's valued as a human experience. This juxtaposition of this beloved earthly moment being invaded by the surrounding darker blues, which due to the UFOs on the previous screen will be understood by the player to be space. This color could also double as being perceived as a night sky, a time culturally to be understood as a time of danger when predators are out. Both of these interpretations are met with the visual contrast of the title's bright yellow shine, which acts as a visual of the hope elicited by the Chosen Four, our heroes. Though the player won't know these characters yet, the visual still stands as an act of heroism in the spite of the odds against it, which is central to Gygas's oppressive force over the world. The music complements this by getting quicker, pushing the player to get on with the game already. We won't be doing this. By waiting on this screen for just a few seconds, the game again fades to black, and the player is given a sneak peek at many notable moments from the game's story, along with the opening credits. These moments are highlighted as notable by the game's visual reluctance to show the whole picture, the characters being put in a spotlight, again reminiscent of the theater. The moments chosen for this scene are all visually diverse, allowing for the game's already large world and adventure to feel that much larger. The game's music is exciting, again pushing the player to start their adventure, as well as introducing musical motifs to the game's sentimental nature. This also is the player's first look at the heroes of the story, and immediately sets up the expectations that they'll be put through many trials and tribulations together and separately. Notably, the final shot shows Ness alone at Giant Step at night, a scene which cannot be replicated in-game. After pressing start, the player is brought to the file select screen. Its green and blue checkerboard background's complete lack of motion accompanied by the file select music, alleviating much of the grander sounds heard on the previous screens. The player is given a moment to breathe. After making a few standard setup choices, the player is given a choice of several flavors for the text box windows. The use of the word flavor indicates a more laid-back mood, going along with the surrounding elements. The previews of each flavor shown to the player as they scroll over them immediately sets up a relationship between the player and the game itself. As the player's already seen several of these text boxes already just to get to this option, they are already aware that this will be a common mechanic throughout the game. The option to choose the text box flavor conveys to the player a sense of caring about them by the game outright saying, hey, you're going to be looking at these windows a lot, you should be at least allowed to like what you're looking at. It's a very small thing, but this helps to set up and further the game's overarching sentimentality, a feeling that is the crux of many significant emotional moments throughout the game's story. By selecting their choice, the player is brought to the naming section of the setup, with the song Your Name Please starting right away. This theme samples the theme to Monty Python's Flying Circus, a theme literally foreign to most of the players, which most won't even notice, but this connection conveys that the game is prepared to be engaging, fun, and silly, as well as aurally indicating the type of humor the game will be going for. Here, the player is introduced to the main protagonist. His animations also add to the casual atmosphere of this moment in the game, though I do wish some of these animations carried more personality. But seeing as the main character is largely left to interpretation by the player, it makes sense that his animations for this sequence would be more general. The player is then asked to please name him. Again, words like please add more than one may think. This consideration was absent from contemporary RPGs, inadvertently coming across much more demanding or just going figure the screen out. The option to scroll through the default names is equally emotional, the option being labeled don't care, which is quite a harsh way to say default. Though up to this point, about a minute in, the game has had a few instances of caring for the player, only for this moment to show that it can swing just as hard in the opposite direction. RPGs with canonical names for their characters would usually just have these names automatically placed in the spaces and allowed for the player to adjust them if they wanted to. But here, ball's in your court. Do you care about this little boy or not? Players familiar with the genre will likely press this without a second thought, but I'd like to primarily focus on the experience of a completely new player. As a new player, I care. I bought this game for $80+. This is my lone birthday present from my family. You better believe I care about this boy. For this playthrough, I will be naming him Leo for the polymath Leonardo da Vinci. Makes sense, as this character's an all-around type when it comes to battling, though the average new player wouldn't know that. The female protagonist will be named Jane for author Jane Austen, a radical, much like the female protagonist, who can take charge and hit hard. I'll be naming our friend Alex after Alexander Forsyth, a European clergyman who was the first to successfully use detonating chemicals in firearms, which this friend often uses as weapons. And I'll be naming our additional friend Saigo for Saigo Tanamo, a samurai from Japan's late Edo period and an integral figure to the formation of Japanese martial arts. The game then asks the player to name their pet, not the protagonist's pet, yours. Pets are significant figures in many children's childhoods, so allowing the player to claim this dog as their own inherently drives for an emotional connection with it. I'll be naming him Casey, after my first dog. In asking for the player's favorite homemade food, the game inadvertently continues its casual tone, though this is likely just due to limited character space. I'll choose roast. For the final naming option, the game asks the loaded question, what's your favorite thing? The more formal phrasing of this question lets the player know that this answer is important. And luckily, the laid-back atmosphere is conducive to letting the player really mull this one over. My favorite thing is joy. The final screen shows the player all of their answers, as some may be forgotten, as some of these questions demand a bit of thinking. I find the use of the phrasing coolest thing as opposed to favorite thing to be a bit of a detriment to the importance of that decision though. Yes, it appeals to the vernacular of the setting the game takes place in, but at the cost of the significance of the question that was undoubtedly the most difficult for the player to answer. Pressing yep, the player is treated with a loud acting as a sort of bell, signifying it's finally time for the fun to begin.